What was that? You stay safe!
The following story contains depictions of supernatural events and suspenseful situations. It is intended for a mature audience who enjoys the thrill of American folklore. Viewer discretion is advised. The Maryland night does not simply fall. It settles like a heavy, damp blanket over the marshes of Dorchester County. Here, where the Chesapeake breeze loses its salt and gains the scent of damp pine and stagnant water, the roads have a way of narrowing until the trees feel like they are leaning in to whisper secrets. It was on such a night, under a moon smothered by thick Atlantic clouds, that Julian found himself driving down the stretch locals call the Blackwater Ribbon. He was a man of steel and stone, an engineer who believed everything had a blueprint and a rational explanation. But the Blackwater Ribbon was a road that didn't care for blueprints. Julian's old sedan hummed, a lonely mechanical heartbeat in a world of silence. He was returning home to settle his late father's estate, his mind occupied by property taxes and structural repairs. The headlights cut twin paths through the encroaching fog, illuminating the gnarled oaks that lined the ditch. Then the radio began to die. It didn't just lose signal. The music slowed, the notes stretching into low, distorted groans before dissolving into a static that sounded like 1,000 dry leaves skittering across pavement. Julian frowned, tapping the dashboard, but the silence that followed was even more unsettling. As he rounded a sharp, unbanked curve, his high beams caught a flash of color that didn't belong in the monochromatic woods. It was yellow, a pale, buttery yellow. A woman stood on the narrow shoulder of the road, her back to him. She wore a long, flowing dress that seemed out of time, the hem stained with the dark mud of the marsh. Her hair was pinned back in a style from another era, and she stood perfectly still, even as the wind whipped the pines around her. Julian's instincts, honed by years of safety inspections, screamed for him to slow down. He braked, the tires protesting against the damp asphalt. He stopped the car 10 feet behind her. The fog seemed to thicken instantly, swirling around the vehicle like a living thing. Julian rolled down his window, the humid air sticking to his skin. "Ma'am?" he called out, his voice sounding thin and fragile against the vastness of the woods. "Do you need help? Is your car broken down?" The woman didn't move. She didn't turn. She simply stood there, staring into the dark wall of trees. Julian felt a prickle of ice at the base of his neck. There were no other cars for miles, and the nearest house was a ruin reclaimed by ivy. Suddenly, the woman's shoulders shifted. She began to turn, not with the fluid motion of a person, but with a slow, mechanical precision. Julian reached for his flashlight, his hands trembling slightly. As the beam swept across her, he realized with a jolt of horror that her feet weren't touching the ground. She hovered an inch above the mud, her dress swaying in a breeze he couldn't feel. When her face finally came into the light, Julian's breath hitched. Her eyes weren't eyes at all. They were swirling vortices of white mist, reflecting his own terror back at him. Before he could react, the interior lights of his car flickered and died. The engine, which had been idling smoothly, gave a final, wheezing gasp and went silent. The darkness that rushed in was absolute. In the sudden void, the woman in the yellow dress was gone. Julian sat in the suffocating quiet, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He reached for the ignition, turning the key frantically, but the car was cold, unresponsive, as if the very life had been drained from its battery. Then came the sound. It started as a faint tapping on the rear passenger window. Tap, 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 tap. It was the sound of a fingernail against glass, rhythmic and patient. Julian froze, staring into the rearview mirror. He could see nothing but the gray haze of the fog, yet the tapping continued, moving slowly from the back window to the driver's side. He realized then that whatever was outside wasn't looking for a ride. It was looking for acknowledgement. The air inside the car grew frigid, his breath turning into a white plume in the dark. Summoning a burst of desperate courage, Julian grabbed his heavy wrench from the floorboard and threw the door open. He stumbled out into the road, swinging the light wildly. The shoulder was empty. The road ahead was empty. But as he turned back to his car, he saw it. Pressed against the mud on the driver's side door was a single, perfect handprint. It wasn't made of dirt or oil, but of a shimmering, bioluminescent frost that was already beginning to fade. The engine suddenly roared back to life on its own, the headlights cutting through the dark like a scream. Julian didn't wait. He scrambled back into the driver's seat, slammed the door, and floored the accelerator. He didn't look back, not even when he felt the distinct sensation of a cold hand brushing against the back of his neck. He drove until the woods thinned and the streetlights of the outskirts appeared, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. That night, as Julian sat in the kitchen of his father's old house, he realized that the world he understood, the world of math and logic, had a hole in it. The woman in the yellow dress had seen him, and in her hollow eyes, he had seen a warning. The Blackwater ribbon wasn't just a road. It was a memory that refused to fade. He knew, with a sinking certainty, that he couldn't leave Maryland until he understood why she was waiting there, and what she wanted from those who dared to drive her cursed path. We often ignore the whispers of our intuition in favor of logic, but some truths are felt long before they are understood. Respect the boundaries of the unknown, for curiosity without caution is a dangerous map to follow. The sun would rise soon, but Julian knew the fog wouldn't truly lift. He looked at the handprint-shaped bruise already forming on his own arm. He had escaped the road, but the road had left its mark on him. The morning sun over Dorchester County was pale and watery, struggling to pierce through the persistent haze that clung to the marshes. Julian woke up in his father's armchair, the light filtering through dusty curtains. His first instinct was to dismiss the previous night as a fatigue-induced hallucination, a trick of the fog and a failing alternator. But as he rolled up his sleeve to check the dull ache in his forearm, his breath hitched. There, imprinted on his skin, was a faint, yellowish bruise in the unmistakable shape of a slender hand. It wasn't just a mark. The skin felt unnaturally cold to the touch, as if the heat of his blood refused to return to that spot. Driven by a mixture of dread and a desperate need for a logical anchor, Julian headed into the heart of the small town. He found himself at the Rusty Anchor, a diner that looked as though it had been bolted to the side of a pier 50 years ago and never moved. The smell of burnt coffee and fried scrapple filled the air, a comfortingly mundane contrast to the ethereal horror of the Blackwater ribbon. He took a seat at the far end of the counter, his eyes scanning the faces of the patrons, weather-beaten fishermen and farmers who looked like they were carved from the very timber of the woods. The waitress, a woman named Martha with silver hair tied in a tight bun, set a heavy ceramic mug in front of him. She didn't ask for his order. She just watched him with eyes that had seen 1,000 tourists and a dozen tragedies. Julian tried to keep his voice steady as he spoke. "Rough night on the roads," he started, attempting a casual tone. "The fog out by the Blackwater stretch is something else. I thought I saw someone out there. A woman, in a yellow dress." The rhythmic clinking of silverware against plates stopped. For a few heartbeats, the only sound in the diner was the low hum of the refrigerator. Martha didn't flinch, but she leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a low murmur. "You're lucky the car started back up, son," she said, her eyes flickering to the bruise peeking out from under his cuff. Most folks who see Clara in her Sunday best don't make it to breakfast the next morning without a tow truck and a priest. An old man at the end of the counter, wearing a tattered camouflage hat, turned his stool toward Julian. "You saw the lantern lady," he wheezed. "That's what the old-timers call her, though she hasn't carried a lantern in a long time. She doesn't need one anymore. She's looking for the light, not carrying it." Julian felt the skepticism he had spent his life cultivating beginning to erode. He asked about 1944, the year he had seen scribbled in a notebook in his father's study. The old man, who introduced himself as Arthur, began to weave a tale that felt as heavy as the marsh mud. In the winter of 1944, the Blackwater Ribbon wasn't paved with asphalt. It was a treacherous logging trail. Clara Vance was a local healer, a woman who knew which roots cured a fever and which berries brought sleep. She was known for her bright yellow dress, a gift from a husband who never returned from the war in Europe. She wore it every Sunday, a splash of hope in a gray, grieving world. One stormy night, a telegram had arrived at the edge of town. A child was dying of respiratory croup in a cabin deep in the woods. Despite the gale-force winds and the rising waters of the marsh, Clara had set out with her medical bag and a kerosene lantern. She never reached the cabin. The wooden bridge over the creek had been weakened by the flood, and as she stepped onto it, the structure vanished into the black water. They didn't find her for 3 days. When they did, she was still wearing that yellow dress, though the color had been leached away by the silt. "The curse didn't start right away," Arthur continued, his voice trembling slightly. "It started when they paved the road. They built the new highway right over the old bridge site. They didn't move the earth. They just smothered it. And ever since, Clara's been there. But she's not just a ghost, boy. She's a sentinel. People say she only appears when something else, something older and meaner, is stirring in those woods. She's the warning, not the threat." Julian felt a cold shiver run down his spine. The tapping on his window, the frozen handprint, it wasn't an attack. It was a desperate attempt at communication. He thought of his father, who had spent his final years obsessed with the local history of the Blackwater marshes. His father hadn't been losing his mind to age. He had been trying to document a pattern. Julian realized that his arrival in town wasn't just about settling an estate. He was being pulled into a narrative that had been left unfinished for 80 years. As Julian left the diner, the bell above the door chiming a lonely note, he noticed a faded photograph pinned to the corkboard by the exit. It was a group shot of a town festival from the 1940s. In the background, partially obscured by the crowd, stood a woman in a pale dress. Even in the grainy, black-and-white image, her posture was identical to the figure he had seen on the road. But as he looked closer, he noticed something the locals hadn't mentioned. In the photograph, Clara wasn't alone. She was holding the hand of a small child whose face had been scratched out of the picture. The sun was higher now, but the air felt no warmer. Julian knew that if he wanted to find peace, and if he wanted that cold bruise on his arm to fade, he couldn't just drive away. He had to go back to the archives, back to the dusty boxes in his father's attic, and find out who that child was. The legend of the Lantern Lady was rooted in a tragedy, but the tragedy had a second half that the town had chosen to forget. Every legend is rooted in a truth that deserves to be heard. When we ignore the stories of the past, we condemn the spirits of our ancestors to repeat their darkest moments. Listening is the first step toward healing. Julian looked toward the distant line of trees where the Blackwater Ribbon began its winding path. The road was calling him back, and this time he wouldn't bring a wrench for defense. He would bring a pen and an open heart. But as he reached for his car door, he noticed a single yellow wildflower tucked under his windshield wiper. There were no such flowers growing in the diner's gravel lot. The attic of Julian's father's house was a cathedral of dust and discarded memories. It smelled of cedar chests, mothballs, and the sweet, cloying scent of decaying paper. Outside, the Maryland rain drummed a restless rhythm against the Victorian gables, but inside, the silence was so thick it felt heavy in the lungs. Julian sat on a milk crate, surrounded by towers of bankers' boxes, each labeled in his father's precise, architectural script. He wasn't looking for property deeds or tax returns anymore. He was looking for the ghost of Clara Vance and the missing child from the photograph. He pulled a box labeled Blackwater Survey, 1982, toward him. His father had been a surveyor for the county for 40 years, a man who literally mapped the bones of the land. As Julian sifted through the yellowed blueprints and topographical maps, a small, leather-bound ledger slid out from between two rolled-up site plans. It wasn't an official county document. It was a personal diary. The ink faded to a ghostly shade of sepia. His father's handwriting here was different, rushed, slanted, and filled with an uncharacteristic tremor. Julian began to read. The entries detailed his father's work during the expansion of the Blackwater Ribbon in the early 80s. The project had been plagued by unexplained delays. Equipment would vanish overnight, only to be found miles deep in the marsh. Workers refused to stay past sunset, claiming they heard a woman singing a mournful lullaby that seemed to come from the very ground beneath their boots. But it was an entry dated November 14th that stopped Julian's heart. The core samples came back today. We didn't hit bedrock at 40 feet. We hit timber, ancient, hand-hewn white oak. The old bridge isn't gone. It's the foundation for the new road. They didn't even remove the wreckage. They just poured the fill over it. May God forgive us for what we've buried. A sudden, sharp coldness filled the attic. Julian's breath misted in the air, a white plume that curled toward the shadows in the corner. He reached for the ledger again, but his hand froze. On the page opposite the entry about the bridge, a damp, yellow petal had appeared. It was fresh, vibrant, and dripping with a single drop of brackish water. He hadn't placed it there. He looked up, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The shadows seemed to be stretching, reaching toward him like long, skeletal fingers. He turned his attention to a folder tucked in the back of the box titled Vance/Whitaker Incident. Inside were newspaper clippings from the Dorchester Gazette, dated December 1944. The headlines spoke of the tragic drowning of Clara Vance, but as Julian read the smaller print, a different story emerged. Clara hadn't just been a healer. She had been a witness. She had been on her way to testify against a local land developer who had been illegally draining the marshes, a process that was causing the very floods that eventually claimed her life. The child in the photograph, the one with the scratched-out face, was Thomas Whitaker. He was the son of the developer. The records indicated that Thomas had fallen ill that night, and Clara, setting aside her legal battle for the sake of her oath, had rushed to save the boy who should have been her enemy's son. She hadn't been a victim of fate. She had been a victim of a man's greed. The bridge hadn't just collapsed. It had been neglected because the funds for its repair had been diverted into the developer's pockets. As Julian absorbed this, a soft, rhythmic thumping began beneath his feet. It sounded like someone walking across the floorboards of the empty room below. Step, drag, step, drag. It was a slow, agonizing pace. Julian stood up, his heart thundering. He crept to the attic stairs and looked down into the darkened hallway. The air was thick with the smell of stagnant water and old, wet wood. At the end of the hall, a faint, rhythmic glow began to pulse. A pale, buttery yellow light that flickered like a dying candle. Clara, Julian whispered, the name feeling heavy on his tongue. The light vanished instantly. In its place, a cold wind roared up the stairs, slamming the attic door shut with a force that shook the entire house. Julian was plunged into total darkness. He fumbled for his flashlight, but when the beam clicked on, the attic had changed. The boxes were no longer neatly stacked. They were overturned, their contents scattered like autumn leaves. And there, standing in the center of the chaos, was the woman in the yellow dress. She didn't look like a monster. She looked like a woman who had been waiting a long time to tell a secret. Her face was pale, her expression one of profound, weary sadness. She held out her hand, and in her palm lay a small, tarnished silver locket. She didn't speak, but a voice echoed in Julian's mind. Not a sound, but a feeling of cold water and a desperate need for justice. "Bring him back," the feeling whispered. "Bring him to the light." Before Julian could reach for the locket, the woman began to dissolve into the mist. As she faded, the attic door creaked open, and the normal sounds of the rain returned. Julian sat on the floor, shaking, his hand clutching the silver locket that was now very real and very cold. He opened the locket. Inside was a tiny, hand-painted portrait of the boy, Thomas Whitaker, and a lock of hair. But on the back of the portrait, written in blood-red ink, was a name Julian didn't recognize. A name that suggested the Whitaker family hadn't disappeared, but had merely changed their identity to hide their shame. Julian realized that the curse of the Blackwater ribbon wasn't a random haunting. It was a debt that hadn't been paid. Clara Vance was holding the road hostage until the truth of that night in 1944 was dragged into the light. He was no longer just a witness, he was the investigator. But as he looked out the attic window toward the woods, he saw something that made his blood run cold. A pair of headlights were idling at the edge of his property. A dark, modern SUV that had been following him since he left the diner. The truth was dangerous, and the living were just as eager to keep it buried as the dead were to dig it up. Julian tucked the locket into his pocket and grabbed his coat. He knew he couldn't stay in the house. The past was no longer confined to books and archives. It was breathing down his neck. He had to find Thomas Whitaker, or whatever was left of his legacy, before the Blackwater ribbon claimed another soul to add to its foundation. Seeking the truth requires more courage than facing a ghost. The dead can only point the way. It is the living who must walk the path of justice, even when that path is overgrown with the thorns of old lies. Julian stepped out into the rain, the locket heavy against his chest. The hunt for the truth had officially begun, but in the dark corners of Dorchester County, some truths were meant to stay drowned. The midnight hour on Blackwater Road feels less like a time and more like a physical weight. It is the moment when the humidity of the Maryland marshes turns into a cold, clinging vapor that smells of ancient silt and rotted vegetation. Julian sat in the driver's seat of his idling car, parked just inside the tree line of a service path a mile away from the infamous curve. In his pocket, the silver locket felt unnaturally heavy, as if it were gathering mass the closer it got to its origin. Behind him, on the main road, the twin pinpricks of headlights from the dark SUV remained stationary, watching him like the eyes of a patient predator. Julian knew he couldn't outrun the living in his aging sedan, and he couldn't outreason the dead from the safety of his father's kitchen. He had come to a realization. The curse was a cycle, and cycles required a catalyst to break. He checked his flashlight, the beam cutting a weak, yellow path through the fog. He had packed a small bag with salt, a flask of water from the town's old well, and the ledger. It was a meager arsenal against the weight of an 80-year-old tragedy, but he was an engineer. He knew that sometimes, all it took to stop a collapsing structure was one well-placed support. He stepped out of the car, the mud instantly sucking at his boots with a wet, squelching sound. The forest was unnervingly quiet. Usually, the Maryland wetlands are a chorus of bullfrogs, crickets, and the rustle of night birds, but tonight, the silence was absolute. The kind of silence that precedes a lightning strike. Julian began to walk toward the spot where the old bridge had once stood, now buried beneath layers of gravel and asphalt. Every few steps, he glanced back. The SUV's lights had clicked off, but the sound of a car door closing echoed through the pines, sharp as a gunshot. As he reached the Blackwater Ribbon's sharpest curve, the atmosphere shifted. The air grew noticeably colder, and the fog began to churn in tight, violent eddies. This wasn't the gentle, mournful presence of the woman in the yellow dress. This felt jagged and old. Julian realized that the Lantern Lady was only one part of the equation. If she was the warning, the threat was the very land she had died upon. A land that had been betrayed by greed and covered in lies. He reached the edge of the road where the asphalt met the marsh, and his flashlight beam flickered. Suddenly, the ground beneath him began to vibrate. It wasn't an earthquake, but a rhythmic, grinding sound, like heavy timbers being dragged over stone. From the dark waters of the marsh, bubbles began to break the surface, releasing a stench of sulfur and stagnant decay. Julian stood his ground, clutching the silver locket. "Clara!" he called out, his voice cracking. "I have it. I have the boy's locket." He didn't know why he felt the need to shout, but the silence of the woods was demanding to be broken. Instead of the woman in the yellow dress, a shadow began to rise from the water. It was tall, amorphous, and draped in what looked like tattered fishing nets and moss. It didn't have a face, only two glowing points of amber light that burned with a dull, mindless hunger. This was the something older and meaner Arthur had mentioned. It was the manifested spirit of the marsh's resentment, fed by decades of toxins and the lingering trauma of those who had been lost within its depths. The creature moved with a slow, inexorable gait, the mud hardening into ice wherever its shadow fell. Julian backed away, his heart hammering. He realized he had made a grave mistake. He had come seeking a ghost, but he had disturbed a guardian of the muck. As he retreated toward the road, he heard the sound of footsteps on the gravel behind him. Fast, heavy, and human. He turned to see a man in a dark tactical jacket, his face obscured by the shadow of a cap. It was the driver of the SUV. The man didn't look like a ghost. He looked like a professional. In his hand, he held a long metal rod, a surveyor's stake, but one sharpened to a lethal point. "Give me the locket, Julian," the man said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "It doesn't belong to you. It's part of a private collection that should have stayed in that attic." Julian realized then that the Whitaker legacy wasn't just a story in a ledger. It was a living enterprise. The family hadn't just changed their name. They had stayed in power, and they were still protecting the secrets buried under the Blackwater Ribbon. The man took a step forward, eyes cold and calculating, completely oblivious to the towering shadow rising from the marsh behind Julian. The supernatural and the mundane collided in a terrifying symphony of violence. The amber-eyed creature let out a sound like a ship's hull tearing open. The man from the SUV froze, his gaze shifting over Julian's shoulder. His face, previously a mask of professional indifference, dissolved into a mask of pure, primal terror. He dropped the metal stake, his hands shaking. That's not her," he whispered, his voice failing. The creature lunged, its mossy limbs reaching for the man who represented the family that had defiled the marsh. Julian didn't stay to watch. He knew that nature and the supernatural both demanded respect, and he had brought neither enough knowledge nor enough protection. He scrambled into the brush, the locket burning against his chest. He realized that the woman in yellow wasn't trying to scare him. She was trying to get him to look at the truth before the marsh reclaimed it all. As he ran through the dark, He heard a scream that was cut short by the sound of rushing water. The road was no longer just cursed. It was actively hunting. He reached his car and fumbled for his keys, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He looked into the rearview mirror one last time. For a brief second, the fog parted. There, standing in the middle of the road, was Clara. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the spot where the man had been. She raised a hand, and for the first time, Julian saw a faint smile on her pale lips. It wasn't a smile of malice, but one of grim satisfaction. The debt was starting to be collected, but the price was going to be higher than Julian ever imagined. Nature and the supernatural both demand respect and preparation. To walk into the dark without understanding the forces at play is not bravery. It is a dangerous arrogance. Always know what you are waking when you go digging for the truth. Julian drove away, the headlights of the empty SUV still glowing in his mirror, a silent monument to a man who thought he could control the shadows. He knew he had to find the rest of the Whitaker story, but the next time he returned to the Blackwater ribbon, he would come armed with more than just a flashlight and a ledger. The silver locket sat on the desk in Julian's father's study, its tarnished surface catching the moonlight like a dying ember. Julian stared at it, his body aching from the encounter in the marsh, but his mind was far too loud for sleep. The air in the room felt thick, charged with the same static he had felt on the Blackwater ribbon. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw those swirling white mists that served as Clara's eyes. He realized that the locket wasn't just an artifact. It was a tether. It carried the weight of a moment that had been frozen in time for over 80 years, and Julian was the only one left who was willing to thaw it. He reached out, his fingers trembling as they brushed the cold metal. The moment he made contact, the walls of the study didn't just fade. They dissolved. The smell of old paper and dust was replaced by the sharp, metallic tang of a thunderstorm and the overwhelming scent of wet cedar. The floor beneath his feet turned from polished oak to sodden, shifting mud. Julian was no longer in the present. He was a passenger in a memory, standing on the edge of the Blackwater Marsh on that fateful December night in 1944. The rain was a vertical deluge, cold enough to turn the skin blue. Through the curtain of water he saw her, Clara. She wasn't the flickering, ethereal spirit he had met on the road. She was vibrant and full of life, her yellow dress a defiant beacon against the gray world. She was struggling against the wind, clutching a heavy leather medical bag to her chest. Her face was etched with a fierce, motherly determination. A few yards ahead of her, a man stood by a black, high-fendered car. It was a younger version of the man Julian had seen in the old photographs. Silas Whitaker. "The bridge won't hold, Silas." Clara's voice rang out, barely audible over the roar of the rising creek. "I told you weeks ago the supports were rotting. You took the money meant for the timber and put it into your own pockets. My husband is overseas fighting for a world that's supposed to be better than this." Silas didn't answer with words. He looked at the churning water and then at the sick child huddled in the back seat of his car. His own son, Thomas. His face was a mask of cowardly panic. He didn't care about the bridge. He only cared about the optics of his failure. Julian watched, a silent ghost in the past, as Clara pushed past Silas. She didn't hesitate. She knew the bridge was a death trap, but she also knew that the boy behind the glass was gasping for air, his lungs filling with the fluid of croup. She stepped onto the wooden planks. The structure groaned, a deep, guttural sound of wood protesting against the weight of the flood. She moved with a healer's grace, her lantern swinging in her hand, casting long, dancing shadows across the white foam of the rapids below. She was halfway across when the first timber snapped. It sounded like a bone breaking. Clara froze. She looked back at Silas, who stood safely on the bank, his hand on the door of his expensive car. He didn't move to help her. He didn't even shout a warning. He simply watched, his eyes wide with a terrible, silent calculation. If Clara vanished, so did the only witness to his embezzlement. If the bridge took her, his secrets would be buried under the silt of the Blackwater. The collapse happened in slow motion. The central support, weakened by neglect and the battering of debris, gave way. Julian reached out, a useless gesture of a man separated by decades, as the bridge folded like a house of cards. Clara didn't scream. She threw her medical bag toward the far bank, a final act of devotion to the child she was trying to save. Then the yellow dress was swallowed by the black, churning maw of the creek. The lantern flickered once, a tiny spark of defiance, before the water extinguished it forever. Julian felt a sudden, crushing pressure in his own lungs. He was underwater, the coldness of 1944 seeping into his bones. He saw Clara's hand reaching upward, not for help, but as if she were trying to catch a falling star. And then he saw it, the hidden danger. Beneath the bridge, trapped in the tangle of fallen trees and iron-rich mud, was something that shouldn't have been there. It was a massive, jagged sinkhole, a geological hunger that the bridge had been masking. The road hadn't just been built over a tragedy. It had been built over a void. The vision snapped. Julian fell back into his chair, gasping for air, his shirt soaked with a sweat that felt as cold as river water. The locket lay quiet on the desk, but the message was clear. Clara wasn't appearing on the road to haunt the living. She was appearing because the void was growing. The modern Blackwater ribbon, with its heavy traffic and shifting soil, was sitting on the same unstable foundation that had claimed her life. The same woman drivers saw was standing at the exact point where the asphalt was thinnest, where the road was destined to collapse again. She was a sentinel, a ghostly traffic controller trying to stop the wheels of the living from spinning into the dark. Julian looked at his arm. The bruise was glowing with a faint, pulsing light. He realized that the curse was actually a long, agonizing rescue mission. Clara had been trying to save the town for 80 years, but they were too busy being afraid of her dress to look at what she was pointing to. Empathy flooded through him, replacing his fear. She wasn't a monster. She was a mother whose heart had never stopped beating for the safety of others. The moral was clear to Julian now. We often fear what we don't understand, labeling the unknown as evil, simply because it disturbs our peace. But the bridge between the living and the dead isn't made of wood or stone. It is made of empathy. By feeling Clara's pain, Julian had finally understood her purpose. But understanding wasn't enough. He looked at the clock. It was 3 a.m. The heavy rains that had started earlier were turning into a seasonal deluge, the same kind of storm that had destroyed the bridge in 1944. Julian grabbed his keys and the ledger. He knew that the modern road wouldn't hold under this much pressure. The sinkhole beneath the Blackwater ribbon was waking up, fed by the storm and the weight of the secrets it held. He had to get to the curve. He had to warn the late-night truckers and the early-morning commuters before the ribbon tore itself apart. But as he ran to his car, he saw a familiar, pale yellow glow waiting for him at the end of his driveway. Clara was there, her form more solid than ever before. She pointed toward the woods, her expression urgent. The time for visions was over. The tragedy was about to repeat itself, and this time, Julian wouldn't be a silent observer. He would be the one to decide if the cycle of the Blackwater ribbon would finally be broken, or if the marsh would claim a new generation of secrets. Empathy is the bridge between the living and the dead. When we stop fearing the other and begin to understand their pain, we find the strength to act. A ghost is often just a voice that was silenced too soon, waiting for someone with the heart to listen. Julian pulled out of the driveway, the tires splashing through the growing puddles. The wind was picking up, and the trees were beginning to lean in. He was heading back to the curve, back to the heart of the curse. The rain was no longer a mere weather event. It was an assault. As Julian drove toward the town center, the windshield wipers on his car struggled to keep pace with the sheets of water that seemed to be falling from a sky made of lead. The wind howled through the gaps in his window seals, a mournful, high-pitched whistle that sounded like a choir of the lost. But it wasn't just the water that was troubling. A thick, unnatural fog began to roll in from the marshes, a fog that didn't behave like mist. It was heavy, clinging to the ground like a gray carpet, and it carried a faint, rhythmic pulse, as if the earth itself were breathing in deep, labored gasps. Julian pulled into the parking lot of the Dorchester County Sheriff's substation, the gravel crunching under his tires. The town of Blackwater felt different tonight. The streetlights flickered with a rhythmic instability, and the neon sign of the local hardware store groaned as it swung in the gale. People were shuttering their windows, but they weren't just preparing for a storm. They were moving with the frantic energy of those who sense a predator in the tall grass. Julian hurried inside, his clothes soaked, the silver locket still clutched in his hand. "Sheriff Miller!" Julian shouted as he burst through the door. The office was dimly lit, the air smelling of stale coffee and damp wool. A middle-aged man with a tired face and a star on his chest looked up from a stack of paperwork. Sheriff Miller was a man of the land, someone who had lived in the shadow of the Blackwater ribbon his entire life. He looked at Julian's disheveled state, his eyes lingering on the bruise on Julian's arm, which was now throbbing with a dull amber light. "Julian, you look like you've been dragged through the marsh backwards," Miller said, his voice cautious. Julian didn't waste time. He spread his father's ledger across the desk and held up the locket. He spoke of the sinkhole, the embezzled funds of 1944, and the structural failure he had seen in his vision. He explained that the modern road wasn't just built on a bridge. It was built on a lie that was physically collapsing under the weight of the storm. The sheriff's expression shifted from skepticism to a grim, weary recognition. "We've known the ground was soft out there, Julian. Every few years we patch the cracks, and the county commissioners tell us it's just settling. But you're talking about something else. You're talking about the Whitaker Foundation." Miller sighed, leaning back. "The Whitakers didn't just build that road. They own the company that maintains it. If what you're saying is true, then the entire infrastructure of this county is a hollow shell." Suddenly, the station's radio crackled to life. A frantic voice broke through the static, a highway patrolman stationed near the curve. "Sheriff, come in. The asphalt. It's moving. I've got a hairline fracture spanning both lanes at mile marker 12, and the water isn't draining. It's being sucked down." Julian and Miller shared a look of pure dread. Mile marker 12 was the exact spot where Clara Vance had disappeared. The weight of the fog wasn't just atmospheric pressure. It was the physical manifestation of 80 years of ignored warnings finally coming to a head. Julian grabbed his engineering kit from his car and followed the sheriff's cruiser, the sirens cutting through the dark like a jagged blade. As they approached the Blackwater ribbon, the fog became so dense it felt like driving through wet wool. Julian could feel the vibration in the steering wheel, a low-frequency hum that vibrated in his teeth. This was the sound of a structural failure on a massive scale. The curse was no longer a ghost story. It was a geological reality fueled by supernatural resentment. They reached the curve just as the patrolman's car was being pushed back by a group of local workers. In the middle of the road, a jagged rift had opened, steam rising from the depths where the cold rain hit the warmer, ancient earth below. Julian knelt at the edge of the crack, ignoring the sheriff's warnings. He shone his heavy industrial light into the rift. He didn't see just mud and rock. He saw the skeletal remains of the 1944 bridge, the white oak timbers still trapped like the ribs of a buried giant. The road was literally tearing itself apart. The woman in yellow appeared again, but this time she wasn't on the shoulder. She was standing directly over the rift, her form glowing with a fierce, blinding light. She wasn't pointing anymore. She was holding the edges of the fog together with her outstretched hands, as if she were trying to physically prevent the road from swallowing the cars that were still idling behind the police barricade. She was the only thing standing between the town and a repeat of the 1944 tragedy. "She's not the one causing this," Julian whispered to the sheriff, who was staring at the apparition in silent awe. "She's the only reason this road hasn't collapsed years ago. She's been holding the weight of our secrets this whole time." Julian realized that his engineering skills were needed now more than ever. He began to direct the crew, using the sheriff's winch cables and heavy-duty boulders from a nearby construction site to create a temporary plug for the sinkhole. He was working in tandem with a ghost, a structural engineer of the living and a sentinel of the dead. As they worked, the dark SUV Julian had seen earlier appeared at the edge of the lights. A man stepped out, not the henchman from the marsh, but an older, more refined version of Silas Whitaker. He looked at the collapsing road not with fear, but with a cold, calculating anger. He saw his family's legacy crumbling, and he saw Julian as the man holding the sledgehammer. "Stop this at once," Whitaker shouted over the wind. "This is private property. You're trespassing on a Whitaker easement." The moral lesson of the night was beginning to solidify in Julian's mind. Ignoring the foundations of the past, the moral and the physical leads to a shaky future. The Whitakers had spent decades building a world on top of a tragedy, believing they could simply pave over their sins. But the earth has a long memory, and the weight of the fog was simply the truth becoming too heavy to carry. Julian ignored the man, focusing on the rift. He knew that justice wasn't just about a court of law. It was about fixing what was broken, starting from the ground up. As the storm reached its peak, a massive section of the shoulder began to slide into the marsh. The woman in yellow let out a silent cry, her form flickering as the strain grew too great. Julian reached out, his hand passing through the cold mist of her presence. For a second, their eyes met, the engineer and the healer. He saw the exhaustion in her white mist eyes. She couldn't hold it much longer. If the road went, it would take the town's main artery and everyone on it with it. Ignoring the foundations of the past leads to a shaky future. We cannot build a lasting peace on a foundation of lies and neglect. To move forward, we must first have the courage to look down and fix the cracks in our own history. The ground gave a final, terrifying groan. The SUV began to slide toward the edge of the rift, its tires spinning uselessly in the mud. Julian had to make a choice. Save the man who represented the family that killed Clara, or save the road? He looked at Clara, and for the first time, she nodded toward the sliding car. Even in death, she was a healer. The scream of metal against stone was a sound that would haunt Julian's dreams for decades to come. As the shoulder of the Blackwater ribbon disintegrated, the heavy SUV carrying Arthur Whitaker began to tilt, its front tires spinning uselessly over a yawning abyss of black mud and churning water. The headlights of the vehicle swept across the trees like a dying lighthouse, illuminating the frantic faces of the road crew and the pale, steadfast figure of the woman in the yellow dress. Time seemed to stretch, thick and viscous as the marsh itself, as the vehicle teetered on the knife edge of total collapse. Julian didn't think about the Whitaker legacy or the threats that had been leveled against him. He didn't think about the 80 years of lies or the bruise on his arm that was now burning with a white-hot intensity. He was an engineer, and an engineer's first duty is to the preservation of life. He grabbed a heavy-duty steel tow cable from the sheriff's cruiser, his boots slipping on the slick, oil-streaked mud. "Miller, get the winch ready," he roared over the thunder. "If that car goes, it takes the whole support column with it." Arthur Whitaker sat frozen behind the wheel, his face a mask of primal, aristocratic terror. He had spent his life protected by walls of money and influence, but the Blackwater Marsh didn't care about a bank account. It only cared about the gravity of the truth. As Julian scrambled toward the teetering SUV, the ground beneath his own feet groaned. He looked down into the rift and saw it. The true monster. It wasn't just a sinkhole. It was a graveyard of history. The receding earth had revealed the original, splintered remains of the 1944 bridge, the jagged white oak beams looking like the ribs of a prehistoric beast emerging from the muck. Suddenly, the shadowy entity from the marsh, the amber-eyed guardian of the silt, rose from the depths of the pit. It wrapped its mossy, elongated limbs around the SUV's rear axle, pulling downward with a slow, rhythmic malice. It was as if the land itself was demanding the life of a Whitaker in exchange for the life it had taken 8 decades prior. The air grew frigid, and the rain turned to stinging needles of ice. Julian reached the vehicle, slamming his hand against the glass. "Unlock the door, Arthur. You have to jump." Whitaker looked at Julian, then looked past him at the woman in the yellow dress. Clara was standing only a few feet away, her form radiating a terrifying, ethereal light. She wasn't the victim anymore. She was the judge. For a heartbeat, the wind died down, and a silence more profound than death fell over the curve. In that silence, the truth was laid bare. The locket in Julian's pocket began to vibrate, and a series of flashes, memories not his own, shot through his mind. He saw Silas Whitaker sabotaging the bridge. He saw the ledger of stolen funds. He saw the cold, calculated decision to let a healer drown to save a reputation. "Your grandfather didn't just let her die, did he?" Julian shouted, his voice cracking. "He ensured the bridge would fail." Arthur's eyes widened, and he finally collapsed into a fit of sobbing. The weight of the secret, carried through 3 generations, finally broke him. "We just wanted to keep the town together," he wailed. "If the truth came out, the company would have folded. The town would have died." It was the classic excuse of the corrupt, protecting the many by sacrificing the one. Clara moved. She didn't attack. She simply placed a pale, translucent hand on the hood of the SUV. The amber-eyed creature let out a frustrated hiss and retreated into the shadows. The light from Clara's form flowed into the vehicle, and for a moment, the SUV seemed to defy gravity. Julian took the opportunity to wrench the door open, grabbing Arthur by the collar and dragging him out onto the crumbling asphalt just as the rear axle snapped. With a final, wet thud, the expensive vehicle vanished into the black maw of the sinkhole. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of the rain. Arthur lay on the mud, gasping and shivering, a broken man who had lost his armor. Sheriff Miller and the patrolman moved in, their flashlights illuminating the wreckage of the road. Julian turned to find Clara, but she had moved to the very edge of the rift. She was looking down at the exposed timbers of the old bridge. Amidst the debris, something glinted in the light. A leather medical bag, preserved by the anaerobic mud of the marsh. Its contents a silent testimony to a woman's final, heroic act. Julian walked to the edge, his heart heavy with a mixture of grief and relief. He realized that justice wasn't just about the SUV in the pit or the handcuffs that Miller was now placing on Arthur Whitaker for the criminal negligence revealed by the records. Justice was about the restoration of a name. He pulled the silver locket from his pocket and held it out toward the ghost. "I found it, Clara," he whispered. "The truth is out. Everyone knows now. You saved them then, and you saved us tonight." Clara Vance turned to look at him one last time. The swirling mists in her eyes had cleared, revealing a soft, human gray. She didn't disappear into a cloud of smoke. She simply began to fade into the morning light that was finally beginning to break over the Atlantic. The yellow of her dress seemed to catch the first rays of the sun, turning from a ghostly pale to a vibrant, warm gold. With a final, graceful nod to Julian, she was gone. The weight of the fog lifted, and for the first time in 80 years, the air on the Blackwater ribbon felt clean. Justice is the only way to quiet a restless spirit. Vengeance seeks to balance the scales with more blood, but justice seeks to balance them with the truth. When we acknowledge the wrongs of the past, we allow the wounds of the present to finally begin their healing. The storm had passed, leaving behind a scarred road and a town that would never be the same. Julian stood on the edge of the new canyon in the asphalt, watching as the sun began to reflect off the stagnant waters of the marsh. The curse was broken, but the work was far from over. The road needed to be rebuilt, properly this time from the bedrock up. The weeks following the great collapse of the Blackwater ribbon were a blur of yellow caution tape, heavy machinery, and the slow, grinding gears of justice. For 80 years, the truth had been held under the pressure of the earth, and when it finally burst forth, it took the town's oldest dynasty with it. The Whitaker Construction Company was dismantled by state investigators who found a paper trail of corruption that stretched back to the end of the Second World War. But for Julian, the structural engineer who had faced the marsh and lived, the real work wasn't happening in the courtrooms of Annapolis. It was happening in the silence of the Dorchester County Archives. Julian spent his final days in Maryland working alongside Sheriff Miller to ensure that the restoration of the road was more than just a matter of gravel and tar. They dug deep, not just into the soil, but into the genealogy of the town. They found the descendants of those who had been healers before the hospitals arrived, and they found the records of the children Clara Vance had saved before her final, tragic walk. The town, once paralyzed by the curse of the woman in yellow, began to realize that their fear had been a mask for their own collective guilt. They hadn't been haunted by a monster. They had been haunted by a witness. The reconstruction of the curve was a massive undertaking. Julian oversaw the installation of deep-driven steel pilings that bypassed the shifting silt and anchored directly into the ancient bedrock. He made sure that the new drainage system followed the natural flow of the marsh, rather than trying to choke it. As the workers cleared the debris from the sinkhole, they finally reached the bottom of the pit, the place where the old 1944 bridge had come to rest. There, preserved in a pocket of air and clay, they found the leather medical bag Julian had seen in his vision. Sheriff Miller and Julian opened the bag in the quiet of the substation. Inside, the glass vials were remarkably intact, though the labels had long since faded. But tucked into a side pocket was something more precious. A damp, folded letter addressed to Clara's husband. It was a letter she had never had the chance to mail. In it, she spoke not of her fears, but of her hope for the town. She wrote about the Blackwater ribbon being a path of connection, a way for the people of the woods to find the help they needed. She hadn't seen the road as a source of profit, but as a lifeline. The day the road reopened was a quiet affair. There were no ribbon cuttings by politicians, no grand speeches by those who had ignored the cracks for decades. Instead, a small group of locals gathered at the curve at sunset. They had erected a modest stone monument on the shoulder, a simple plinth of Maryland granite. On it was a bronze plaque that didn't mention the Lantern Lady or the curse. It simply read, Clara Vance, 1912 to 1944, a healer who never stopped watching over us. Beneath her name was an engraving of a single wildflower. Julian stood at the edge of the new asphalt, the sun dipping below the horizon and casting long, purple shadows across the water. The marsh was no longer silent. The bullfrogs had returned, and the wind through the pines sounded like a soft, rhythmic lullaby rather than a mournful groan. He felt the weight in his pocket, the silver locket. He walked to the monument and placed the locket into a small, hollowed-out niche behind the plaque. As he let go of the metal, he felt a sudden, profound lightness. The bruise on his arm, which had been a dull ache for weeks, finally vanished, leaving behind nothing but healthy, pink skin. Sheriff Miller walked up beside him, his boots clicking on the fresh, solid pavement. "You think she's gone for good, Julian?" he asked, looking out over the water. Julian watched as the first stars began to pierce through the twilight. He thought about the laws of thermodynamics, that energy cannot be destroyed, only transformed. Clara Vance's energy had been tied to a debt that had finally been paid. "I think she's retired," Julian said with a faint smile. "She spent 80 years on duty. It's time she had a Sunday off." As Julian drove away that night, heading back toward his own life in the city, he reached the sharp curve of the Blackwater ribbon. Instinctively, he slowed down. His headlights swept across the monument, then across the marsh. For a fleeting second, he saw a flicker of color in his rearview mirror. It wasn't the pale, sickly yellow of a ghost, nor was it the terrifying white mist of a sentinel. It was a warm, golden glow, like the first light of a hearth on a cold winter night. It didn't block the road. It seemed to light the way, guiding him safely toward the highway. The drivers on Blackwater Road still see a woman, but the stories have changed. They don't speak of car engines dying or of frozen handprints on the glass. Now, the locals tell tales of a guardian in gold. Travelers who find themselves tired or lost on the stormy nights of Dorchester County report a strange phenomenon. A feeling of being watched over, a sudden clarity of mind that helps them navigate the dangerous curves. Some say they see a woman in a bright yellow dress standing by the monument, not pointing in warning, but waving a gentle hand as if to say, "Go on home. The road is safe." Julian's father's house was eventually sold, but Julian kept the ledger. He didn't keep it as a reminder of the horror, but as a reminder of the responsibility. We are all engineers of our own history, he realized. We are the ones who choose what to bury and what to build upon. The Blackwater ribbon was no longer a cursed stretch of Maryland Road. It was a testament to the power of a single life and the enduring strength of a truth that refused to stay drowned. We are the caretakers of the stories of those who came before us. When we choose to remember with honor rather than fear, we transform our ghosts into guardians. The past is not a weight to be carried, but a foundation to be understood. If you walk with honesty and respect, even the darkest road will eventually lead you to the light. As the moon rose over the Chesapeake, the Blackwater ribbon stretched out like a dark, peaceful vein through the heart of the marsh. The silence was no longer heavy. It was a sanctuary. The woman in the yellow dress had finally found her peace, and in doing so, she had given the town back its soul. But somewhere on another lonely stretch of American asphalt, another legend is waiting to be heard, for the heart of the country is vast, and its memories are long.